Hi, everyone. This is Heather Box from the Million Person Project. And the Million Person Project is a global project about love, storytelling, and connecting change makers. And I am here today with the co-founder and CEO of Be More, Anurag Gupta. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation about the power of personal storytelling.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Be More?
So, absolutely. So, hi, I'm Anurag Gupta, and I am the co-founder and CEO of Be More. And we are imagining a world where people's life opportunities and experiences are not determined by the way they look, either their physical appearance, race, ethnicity, gender identity, you name it. A place where we can just be who we are as human beings.
I've heard people talk about Be More like Be More is trying to eliminate racism in our lifetime and these kinds of big statements. What's true?
Not our lifetime. We have 25 years. We're 24 now. It's 2016. So we started this work in 2014, and we launched with this incredible campaign in 2014 called Vision 2040. 2040 is a year where there will be no racial majority in America. So we're all going to be minorities. And what we did was we went to some of the leading entrepreneurs and artists and faith-based leaders and community organizers across the country from all different backgrounds, socioeconomic class, criminal conviction status, you name it, and really asked them to imagine what is it that we want to imagine for our country in 25 years. We want to create a beloved community, right? That's what we want in our country. But that's going to require some qualitative and quantitative shifts in our lives and in our souls. So what are those shifts? So that's where we started. We actually asked people to talk about one change, one shift we need to make to get there. And through that work, we learned that, wow, there's a significant way in our society in which we other and create distance between people. And what is the root of that distancing? It's this project that you're doing. It's storytelling. We have constructed stories in our heads about other people, about Muslims, about Black people, about Latinos, about Mexicans, about women. And when we believe those stories, and those stories are reinforced by our cultural surroundings, by our media, by our leaders, by people we trust, by family members, we follow those stories. We other people. And that leads to what? That leads to policies that don't provide enough resources for people to go to schools, to have access to technology, to have access to healthcare, for certain people to be brutalized by the police, for being looked upon with suspicion, right? And that creates suffering and misery for everybody in community. So for us, it's like, wow, like, we've come at a point in our humanity where we know the causes of these challenges. Science has told us, like social scientists, natural scientists have done the work. And we want to apply this work to really begin to build bridges between human beings. Because that's what we are, human beings.
Yeah, and I've heard you say, over and over again, there's no gene for race. There is no gene for race. So can you tell our viewers a little bit about what you mean by that?
Absolutely. So 16 years ago, there was this massive project, global project, called the Human Genome Project, which basically mapped the entire sequence of the human DNA. And what it found was that there's actually no fundamental difference between what we call races between human beings. So there's not one gene for Black people and one gene for Native American people and one gene for Chinese people. Actually, we're all human beings. And, so what that means is two random Russians could be just as different genetically than a Russian and a Kenyan, or a Kenyan and a Chinese person. That's how just human variation works. And it also makes sense if you think about it. In our country, people we call Black or people we call Latino, right, are mixed people. They have ancestry that's European, that's Native American, that's Asian, that's African. They're mixed people. But historically, we've created stories about Blackness, right? So you can actually have someone who looks completely white, but identifies as Black because one of their grandparents or great-grandparents was Black. And they have some element of that cultural pride. And they grew up in a culture that told them they were Black, even though they look white, you know? And that's something, you know, that we understand and accept. But because there's a story around Blackness and whiteness, right? Whiteness means being purely white, purely European, no mixture with anybody else. And those stories continue to break us apart, continue to create divisions within our society. But why it's really, really detrimental for communities of color is because those stories have negative implications for those communities. You know, there's stereotypes that have been created for Black people, for Mexican people, for Asians, and those stories travel with them everywhere, and unfortunately have impacts on their life, beginning to end.
Yeah, and you know that makes me wonder, and I know a lot of people wonder, and this is why you have told your story in really powerful and public ways, but it makes me wonder, what is your story of, you know, of starting this? What is your story with race? How did you begin Be More, and why?
Good question. We're going to go there. Well, so I immigrated to America when I was 10 years old, and I grew up in India before I came here. And in India, there's no construct of race. There are other ways human beings are divided and put on hierarchies, but race as in a physical marker of humanity wasn't present. But coming here, I was always like, people were constantly putting me in boxes that I didn't fit into. And I always found myself as Asian or other, but neither of those really felt true to who I am in terms of my ethnic identity as well as my cultural background, right? Punjabi, Himachali, North Indian, you name it. But that had an implication on my sense of self and sense of perceiving myself. So constantly people were asking me, what are you? What are you? What are you? You're not really American. Oh, you're probably half white, when I said I was American. So there was a perception of what American meant. And I would try to confront these types of constant, you know, trivial questioning with achievement. You know, I did really well in school. I would continue to excel in school, went to graduate school, got a law degree, constantly performing. But, you know, this one time I was at my doctor's office and I walked in and it was really full. So I stepped outside. I knew that he would just come and get me outside. And he came in. His name was Kelly. So Kelly brought me in. And suddenly a woman speaks. This is in front of other people, saying that, oh my gosh, I was wondering who that strange and suspicious man is. What is he doing here? And I was just like, what just happened? Strange and suspicious man just by looking at me? So of course, my doctor and I processed this, but these types of incidents kept making me feel less than. And for me, this became really personal because 7 years ago, I underwent like this massive phase of depression where I actually attempted suicide because of not feeling like I belonged, not feeling like I was enough, not feeling like I could live up to what people thought was acceptable in society. Yet, you know, what my saving grace was what I was doing, which was reading and educating myself on what was going on in the world. And I realized that all of these things that people are projecting onto me are merely stories. They have an imagined understand of my humanity. And who am I? Anurag, right? That's who I am. But they perceive me as male, as Indian, as immigrant, as potentially Muslim, whatever. And those identities carry with it stories. And none of them can be true. But that's how I'm experiencing life because of their stories. And I was able to do the inner work around decoupling that from myself through mindfulness, present moment awareness without judgment.
Wow.
And that's what Be More is wanting to do for other people, bringing mindfulness within these conversations, bringing mindfulness to really decouple stereotyping and our conditioned way of thinking from our behaviors and actions, so we can actually build intimate relationships with other human beings, and also transform the society that needs to be transformed, to address issues around equity and access in healthcare, in education, in criminal justice, in policing, because these biases are interfering in everyday realities in ways we can't even fathom and imagine.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that, Anurag. It's so clear to me why Be More is your work when you share like that. So thank you. And if you could tell us and the viewers, what is one place where these biases are getting in the way and where you are working to bring mindfulness and, the deconstruction of these biases into that place?
Absolutely. So one example I'll give you is from healthcare. So what happens is, and there have been so many studies around this across the country, and they've controlled for every factor, socioeconomic status, education, you name it. And they've found is that Black patients, from children to senior citizens, are prescribed less pain medication than white patients. When they go to the ER, when they go to the doctor, over and over again, controlling for everything else. And so people can actually be like, I'm in a lot of pain, but they're not prescribed that pain medication. And, you don't spend very much time with doctors, and doctors aren't doing this intentionally. But what's happening really is there's a story of what pain means and how pain is actually felt in the body by people, by other people. And that is happening at the subtle unconscious level. So until we can make those unconscious stories conscious, we can't transform that behavior.
So when you go in and you speak to healthcare workers and you present these kinds of, you present this research to them, are they surprised?
See, they are surprised, right? They're absolutely surprised. And they're like, well, I don't do that, which is fine, which they may not actually, because everything is a bell curve. But what happens is, you're in that interaction. And of course, bias is the last thing you're worrying about. You have, for doctors, and I totally sympathize and empathize with doctors across the country. They have a lot on their plate. They have to see patients 15 minutes at a time. It's kind of a treadmill or assembly line, that they have to go through. So the decisions, they're just like, okay, checking off, I've done the diagnosis. Okay, this is how much pain medication you need. Okay, get out of my face. Or not that, in that way, but okay, I'll see you again. But at the unconscious level, they are prescribing a certain dosage to people, whites and Blacks, Asians, Latinos, based on their perception of those people. And they can understand that.
Right.
And they can also understand that everything I'm sharing is evidence-based. This is where science comes in. We have such sophisticated instruments to be able to measure and assess behavior and attitudes. And we're just sharing that. We're becoming that gap between information and the communities that are impacted. And they receive it as a result and actively want to transform these behaviors so it doesn't interfere in their decision making.
Right. So obviously, like, healthcare is one area, and then, what's going on right now in the world, police, that's another major area. What other areas are you seeing this bias having a really potentially harmful impact on the people that they're supposed to be serving?
So there's different kinds of biases, right? But the racial bias, unconscious racial bias, let's look at it in an education setting. So we have in our country, over almost 50% or over 50% of all children are of color. So they're from minority backgrounds, what we call minority right now. And about 85% of all teachers are white. So there's already a cultural disparity there, right? And we also live in a country that's hyper segregated, which what that basically means is that 2/3 of Americans need to move neighborhoods for us to be fully integrated.
Wow.
2/3. And this is 60 years after Brown v. Board of Education, right? The seminal Supreme Court case. So that means that a lot of these teachers are also living in very homogeneous settings with people that look like them. So white teachers around white people, but they're serving children who are non-white. And their understanding of those children are not a product of intimate interactions with those communities and their struggles and their life experiences, but what they have consumed in their lifetime about them.
Right.
Media stereotypes. So when you're in an underserved community working with, let's say, predominantly Black or Latino children, you're perceiving them through that lens. So if a child is speaking in a certain way, which is the product of the culture in which he or she was raised, they're just being a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old or 8-year-old, but they're being perceived as a threat. Because that's how the brain is conditioned to see those little children. And then we see, as a result, suspension rates go up, expulsion rates go up. And this is how we have the school to prison pipeline. Because there isn't the heart connection, there isn't trust of the children. These are children, 8, 9, 10 years old. But they're not allowed to be children because they're already perceived as a threat. And it's so strong. It's like the limbic system is triggered. We see this in the police interactions, with African Americans, with other minority groups. What's going on? The second you have a visual stimulus of a Black man, something is going on in the bodies of those police officers that like enables them to shoot 20, 30, 40 times.
Right.
What kind of a threat is that?
Right.
What is actually happening in that person's body, in their nervous system, that lets them do that? And that is the type of transformation we need. We can actually flush out this poison that we've inherited and imbibed from our cultural surroundings.
Wow. And so what is the first step is knowing that these biases exist. And then what is the next step? What do you mean bring mindfulness to these professions?
So for us, it's really about first understanding how these biases have become a part of our lives. So there are specific causes of these biases, right? And then every time they arise, you become mindful of them through specific practices. So just like we practice, the piano a million times before we know how to play the piano, or to drive a car, we need to practice being with people from different cultures. So like I meet you, hi, Heather Box. I have an understanding of what a blonde woman is or is not, right? But every time those thoughts arise, I'm like, oh, okay, no, I'm with Heather Box, who has blonde hair, who is a white woman, but I'm with Heather Box. And that practice is through, and research has shown through mindfulness meditation particularly, we have the ability to rewire our brain.
Right. So cool.
And it's called neuroplasticity. So we can rewire the way we perceive people and actually then build real bridges, real connection with our students, with our patients, with citizens, with our employees. A lot of the stuff also happens around like hiring as well as promotions. You could have two equally hardworking employees who've done a lot of work, but oftentimes employees of color are not promoted because they're not the right cultural fit or some other explanation, right?
Right.
And I don't mean to be sarcastic. It's not that there's anything wrong with it, but unless we're aware of these unconscious biases, we can't do anything about it.
So I'd love to ask you a couple more questions about you and your process with sharing your own story, but I'd love for you to tell the viewers how they can get involved with Be More. How can they, do you do workshops? Do you do coaching? How do they get involved?
So there's a couple of ways. Well, first of all, check us out at bemoreamerica.org, or check us out on any of our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at Be More America. And we do in-person workshops. They're 3.5 hours around reducing unconscious bias. We've also done webinars, and we're also open to doing presentations that fit people's different needs. So just reach out to us. Info@bemoreamerica.org.
Cool. Yeah, I can think of